Hello, everyone, and welcome to this last webinar of the Reality of Net Zero seminar series. This is a collaboration between Oxford Net Zero, the Zero Institute, and the Oxford Earth Sciences. During the last 8 weeks, the series has been covering topics related to the architecture of net zero, from international law to energy systems, and you can find all the recordings and slides on our website. During this session, you'll be able to ask questions by using the Q&A function and also vote for the ones that you like and agree with. And today we are gonna bring nature to this net zero debate. I'm Aline Soterroni. I'm one of the Oxford Net Zero Fellows. I'm also part of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, and I'm a land use modeler and interested in scenarios modeling for climate and environmental policy evaluation, with a particular focus on the most megadiverse country in this planet, Brazil. I'm honored to have Professor Natalie Seddon with me today, who is a scientific authority in biodiversity and nature-based solutions. Nat, would you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Alina. It's wonderful to be here. So yeah, I'm Nat Seddon. I'm a professor of biodiversity based in the Department of Biology and the Smith School for Enterprise and the Environment. I'm director of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative and the Agile Initiative here at the University of Oxford. By training, I'm an ecologist and evolutionary biologist, but I've been working at challenges at the nexus of biodiversity loss, climate change, and poverty for the last 8 or so years.
Thank you, Nat. And we are going to give a presentation together to show why net zero needs nature and nature needs net zero, starting with net zero needs nature. Well, our best chance to limit warming to below 2 degrees and close to 1.5 is almost halve emissions this decade and achieve net zero carbon dioxide or CO2 emissions by mid-century and greenhouse gas emissions or GHG emissions in the second half of the century. And to this end, we need to massively reduce and remove our emissions from the atmosphere. In our current global carbon cycle, most of the CO2 emissions are from fossil fuels, but land use change and agriculture, including deforestation, is also a significant source of emissions. And we are basically only relying on the biosphere or nature to remove carbon. The land and the ocean sinks are removing between 50 and 55% of our current CO2 emissions. And to improve our chances of reaching net zero, we need to preserve and enhance these carbon sinks. And the best way to do that is for nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions involve a wide range of actions, including protection, restoration, sustainable management of ecosystems, which provide multiple benefits, as you can see in this blue part of the diagram. Benefits such as emissions reduction, flood control, food and water supply, all contributing to human well-being and supporting biodiversity. In other words, nature-based solutions mean working with and enhancing nature as part of nature to address societal goals while providing local benefits for biodiversity and people. And examples of nature-based solutions include protection, restoration, and sustainable management of forests, which offer biodiversity conservation, but also carbon storage. Apologies, tech problems. It happens from time to time. And I believe you stopped listening when I was showing the examples of nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions involve protection, restoration, and sustainable management of forests, which provides biodiversity, but also carbon storage, and also can reduce flood risks, landslides, while regulating water and climate. Like forests, peatlands regulate fresh water, prevent flooding, store carbon as well, and restoration of coastal ecosystems like mangroves protects communities by reducing wave energy and coastal flooding while supporting biodiversity and building resilience, climate resilience. But nature-based solutions also include sustainable management of our working lands. We need a transformation in our food systems. And agroforestry, for example, increases crop yields, reduces emissions, and stores carbon. Green infrastructure in urban areas also bring nature into cities, protects people against flooding and heat waves, and improve human well-being. And I'd like to call attention to CDR. And by the way, there is a great webinar from this seminar series exclusively about CDR, presented by Steve Smith. And an important question here is, are biological CDRs or carbon dioxide removals nature-based solutions? Well, to answer this, let's zoom in into very popular CDRs, afforestation and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. Afforestation refers to the process of planting trees on land that was not previously covered by trees. And actually, monocultures with non-native tree species in non-forest ecosystems compromise water and food security as well as local livelihoods. So giving these potential negative impacts, afforestation in general is not a nature-based solution. And alternatively, restoration of native ecosystems is a nature-based solution that benefits both carbon and biodiversity. BECCS is another biological CDR. It involves capturing and permanently storing CO2 from processes where biomass is converted into fuels or directly burned to generate energy. And as afforestation, BECCS is widely used in integrated assessment models, or IAMs, which are the models commonly used to estimate net zero pathways. BECCS is popular in IAMs because it offers both an alternative to fossil fuel burning, but it's also considered a negative emissions technology. But there are significant concerns regarding the scale of BECCS or the reliance on this type of CDR. And let's look at these IPCC net zero pathways to achieving 1.5-degree goal. P1 and P4 are two extreme scenarios here. P1, in P1, net zero is achieved mainly due to a rapid decarbonization of the energy system combined with afforestation. And in P4, emissions reductions are mainly achieved through the deployment of BECCS, as you can see in the yellow part. And we are absolutely nowhere near to P1 at this moment. And on the other hand, the possibility of achieving net zero while relying too much on BECCS is problematic because it would require a huge amount of land dedicated to bioenergy crops. 7.2 million square kilometers is nearly the size of Australia, and a more recent study points to even larger areas than 7.2, reaching 9.9 million square kilometers dedicated to produce energy. So this biomass for energy. So this would increase the competition for land, drive up food prices, create social impacts, increase deforestation, and negatively impact biodiversity. So in summary, BECCS is not a nature-based solution, but what is important and what I wanted to raise here is we need to discuss the sustainability limits of CDR. And regarding the question if biological CDRs are nature-based solutions, not all biological CDRs are nature-based solutions. To be a nature-based solutions, we need to follow some guidelines regarding high integrity. So a nature-based solution nature-based solutions are not substitute for the rapid phase-out of fossil fuels. They involve a wide range of ecosystems. They are place-based partnership between people and nature, and last but not least, they support biodiversity. So, nature-based solutions can help preserve our land and ocean sinks. And in fact, the biosphere has the potential to remove and restore more carbon through NBS. The question is how much more? We have a growing agreement on the global nature-based solutions climate mitigation potential around between 10 and 11.7 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, half of it mainly coming from protection, and the other half by enhancing sinks through sustainable management and restoration. And this number corresponds to between 23 and 27 of our current carbon dioxide emissions per year. This is a global estimate, and it's important to mention that while global modeling, global pathways, they are important to define the general direction of travel, there are huge regional variations in the mitigation potential in nature-based solutions on land. And this study, for example, the authors showed that in 50% of tropical countries, nature-based solutions could mitigate over half of their national emissions in a cost-effective way. And if we zoom in Brazil, according to our study, for Brazil, nature-based solutions could mitigate nearly 80% of the country's net zero pledge. So by prioritizing nature-based solutions, Brazil can rapidly reduce emissions while preserving a significant portion of the planet's biodiversity and building resilience against climate change impacts. So for Brazil, we can say there will be no net zero without nature-based solutions. And just to conclude my part on the net zero needs nature, let me give a final example. The Amazon rainforest holds more than 10% of the Earth's terrestrial biodiversity and 10% of all known fish species. 20% of global freshwater supplies flows from the Amazon. It's home to 47 million people, including local communities, and 2.2 million indigenous inhabitants whose cultures and livelihoods are deeply connected to nature. Through transpiration, the Amazon contributes up to half of the regional rainfall, making it resilient to drought. But one could argue that net zero and the climate debate should focus exclusively on carbon. So then let's ignore all these important and vital aspects, and let's look at the Amazon only through the lenses of carbon. So the Amazon rainforest stores between 250 and 300 billion tons of carbon. And this is equivalent to between 15 to 20 years of global greenhouse gas emissions. So if the Amazon achieves a tipping point where it shifts from being a carbon sink to a carbon source, global net zero would be at serious risk. And instead of being an ally against the climate crisis, the Amazon would accelerate it. And in fact, 17% of the Amazon has been deforested, and the top priority is to prevent deforestation and prevent Amazon from reaching its tipping point through protection. Not only this, but this is the top priority. And finally, I'd like to recognize that nature-based solutions alone are not enough to reach net zero, but I'd also like to emphasize that without nature, there will be no net zero. And so far, I just focus on the carbon, but we need to have a net zero discussion beyond carbon. So over to you, Nat.
Okay. Thank you very much, Eline. So yeah, now I want to build on everything that Eline has been talking about and really sort of talk and explore and unpack this idea that net zero doesn't just need nature. the biodiversity of that nature, the biodiversity of the natural world is incredibly important, and net zero needs biodiversity. And so what a great way to end your section, Alina, with talking about the most biodiverse region on the planet and why it's so important. So I think it's important to sort of step back a bit and make sure we're all clear about what biodiversity is, because actually there is still quite a lot of confusion about it. And so it has a formal definition. This was the definition agreed on by the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, the sister Rio Convention to the UNFCCC, and it's defined as variability among living organisms from all sources, including terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic systems, and the ecological complexes of which they are a part. And this includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. Put simply, biodiversity is the diversity of life from the level of the gene right up to the level of the ecosystem. So it's a property of nature, and we know, and I will describe in brief shortly, it's a property that ensures the resilience and the adaptive capacity of our ecosystems. And as I will argue, in a rapidly changing, in a rapidly warming world, we really need this property. We need biodiversity more than ever. So just to sort of hammer home the point, biodiversity is not the same as nature, as wildlife, as natural resources, natural capital, ecosystem services, green infrastructure, the biosphere, all these other words that are often used or confused with the term biodiversity. It is the property of nature that we really need to protect and restore and enhance if we are to get any benefits from nature at all. It's also, I'm sure you're all aware of this, but it's also very important not to lose sight of the fact that the distribution of this diversity of life is not even across the globe. As we travel from the cool poles to the warm equator, so that diversity increases dramatically. And an illustrative point, if we take a hectare of a really high quality woodland in this part of the world, we might find at most 30 to 40 species of breeding bird. We go to North America, that might increase to around 120, but if we go to the heart of the Amazon, or especially that part of the Amazon where the Amazon meets the Andes, that number will increase to over 550 or more. So there's this huge turnover of species richness as we travel around the world, and especially as we travel towards the equator. So what's happening in the tropics, what's happening in the equator is incredibly important. These are also parts of the world, incidentally, where much of the carbon is also to be found, much of the biospheric carbon. Now, biodiversity is really important as it really underpins the resilience of our ecosystems, as I have said. In other words, the capacity of a system to not only resist perturbation, but also to recover from it. So a system could be highly resistant and have slow recovery, or can be, have very low resistant and fast recovery, or it can have low resistance and low recovery. And what we're finding is the way we treat our natural and semi-natural ecosystems, fragmentation, degradation, and pollution, logging, and so forth, this both lowers the resistance and lowers the recovery. But we know from sort of decades of science and millennia of traditional knowledge that to be healthy and resilient, they need to be very biodiverse and connected, as I'll explain, and that these healthy ecosystems support the critical needs of societies and economies. So there is much science supporting the fact that nature-based solutions or ecosystems of which they comprise need to be connected to one another. So they need not to be isolated projects. And this allows for the migration and movement of genes and species to track their ecological niches over time as an adaptive response to change. And we know that the diversity of life, whether that's taxonomic diversity, functional diversity, phylogenetic diversity, and so forth, that can safeguard the evolutionary potential of ecosystems and buffer against change. And so we know from a rich body of evidence that the more biodiverse ecosystems are, the more able they are to accommodate climate extremes, pathogens, migration, and that data is, from a variety of ecosystems, with the richest data coming from studies of forests as well as grasslands. And we know that these studies together show that the efficiency and also the stability of critical ecological functions, such as resource capture, biomass production, decomposition, nutrient cycling, all these critical ecological functions, that they increase in their efficiency and stability with the more species or the more genes or the more habitats there are. As that increases, those two things are very strongly related. And we know that there are high impacts of losing richness across trophic levels with cascading effects. And so there have been a number of studies, but this one I think is a really important one to highlight. This was published in Science nearly 3 years ago. And this was very clear in showing, it was a great study because it was a paired global analysis showing that native or naturally regenerating forests stored more carbon, had much higher water availability, prevented erosion more effectively, and also harbored more biodiversity, more species, when compared with low diversity plantations, monoculture plantations in particular, that Eline have already mentioned, the types of interventions that tend to be highlighted in the integrated assessment models. So we know from science and from practice that biodiversity is that which secures the flow and resilience of all that nature provides. It's not so much that biodiversity is a nice to have, a useful thing to protect and enhance if resources allow. It's not another ecosystem service. It's actually the foundation of a thriving economy. And this idea is at the core of our understanding of what a nature-based solution is. And so this is, I think, really well captured by this redrawing of the Sustainable Development Goals that was done by the Stockholm Resilience Centre a few years ago, which shows the interdependence of the economy on society and society on the biosphere. And yet we know the way funding is currently allocated and the way policy is currently oriented, that tends to be actually prioritized in the reverse order to the one that ecological knowledge and natural and social sciences teaches us is more realistic. And so, yes, good, strong, biodiverse, healthy, flourishing ecosystems are at the heart of our economy. This has been recognized in many different editions over the last few years of the Global Risks Report, including the most recent one published a couple of months ago, showing that when you look at the global risks to the economy, certainly those long-term risks, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse are ranked very highly, second on this list, as shown here. And this has been a picture that's been painted by the World Economic Forum for a number of years now. So the point here is biodiversity. Net zero needs nature. That nature needs to be biodiverse. But I also wanted to highlight the fact that we not only need to think about the biodiversity of nature-based solutions, we also need to think about the indigenous peoples and local communities that rely on, that have worked with nature and worked with biodiversity as part of biodiversity for millennia. And there's a huge importance of working with indigenous peoples and local communities across the world. There's the overarching ethical imperative, of course, but there are 3 sort of very practical reasons why this is essential. We know that much of the world's biodiversity is very robustly protected within indigenous territories, where we also find much lower levels of deforestation compared to private lands, and in some cases protected areas. There was a really interesting study published a few years ago in Nature Sustainability, providing very compelling evidence that this was the case, and really highlighting the fact that support from indigenous peoples was crucial for the protection of biodiversity, and that conservation efforts must therefore support the rights and recognise the vital role of these communities around the world when it comes to conservation. The second practical reason is that indigenous and local ecological knowledge is extremely important. It's an adaptive knowledge system honed over millennia through observation and an experiment. And there is now a lot of evidence showing that this is vital for effective species conservation and adaptive management in many parts of the world. The third reason is that many, not all, but many Indigenous peoples around the world have an ecocentric worldview. So that is a worldview that recognises the value, the intrinsic value in ecosystems, and sees human beings very much part of a rich web of life and a partner of nature rather than a pest or a conqueror. So this is a different way of viewing humans' role and seeing humans as part of this rich web of life. And this leads to a different way of relating to the natural world, which I think has a lot to offer in terms of shining light on understanding how we can better work with the natural world as part of it. And so just to note, a very important thing happened at the CBD COP16 in Cali last year. There was an establishment of a new subsidiary body to enable the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So net zero needs biodiversity, and the Indigenous peoples and local communities that have been effective stewards of biodiversity in much of the world for millennia. But what's happening to this biodiversity? Well, we know that biodiversity is in free fall. And consequently, the health of our ecosystems and the communities that depend upon those ecosystems, which is all of us, is under threat. Recent statistics provided by WWF in their Planet in Peril Living Planet reports show that there has, on average, been around a 73% decline in vertebrate wildlife populations since the 1970s. We know that up to 1 million species are threatened with extinction or are predicted to go extinct by the end of the century. And, you know, there are all sorts of other statistics about the state of the biosphere, which you probably don't need to go into now. But the main drivers of this are changes in land and sea use, direct exploitation, pollution, invasive alien species, and climate change. And climate change is increasingly becoming an important, very significant driver of biodiversity loss, particularly where it interacts with land use change and direct or overexploitation of organisms on land and in the sea. And we also know that climate change, you know, we know that the predictions that of an increasing probability of triggering multiple climate tipping points if we exceed 1.5 degrees of warming since pre-industrial times, which will lead to complete transformation of major parts of the biosphere, which of course is very bad news for biodiversity. So biodiverse nature needs net zero. I want to clarify this a little bit more. We know that under different climate change scenarios, we will lose most of our reefs. So if we exceed 1.5 degrees of warming, then we will lose between 70 and 90% of our coral reefs. And these are extraordinarily species-rich, biodiverse ecosystems that we have. 2 degrees of warming, we will lose 99% of our coral reefs. We also have, these analyses have been conducted on lots of different parts of the tree of life. For example, in mammals at 1.5 degrees, 4% of mammals will lose half their habitat. If we go up to 3 degrees, 41% of mammals will lose half their habitats. Why does climate change, other than the complete loss of habitats, that will be triggered by tipping points in an acute impact of climate change on biodiversity? Why? Often people will ask, can't biodiversity evolve? Can't there be, adaptive evolution in response to this? Well, when the environment changes, organisms that are poorly suited to their location can change their behavior and breed earlier, and many species are now doing that. They could move, so they could change, they could track their ecological niche over time, and there are examples of this all over the world where species are moving their ranges, they're heading north or they're moving upslope, or they can adapt, so they can change their phenotype to better suit their location. And if they can't do any of those three things, then they go extinct. But all of these things are, the rate of environmental change, the rate of climate change is outpacing the ability to move in time or to change behavior, and certainly to adapt, which is why increasingly as the planet warms, so more and more species will go extinct. Currently, around 7% of population declines are estimated to be driven by climate change alone. There have been so far a handful of climate change extinctions in coral reef communities and also in montane zones and amphibians. But predicted extinction risks from climate change will accelerate as global temperature rises. But the predicted extinction rates from climate change will, as you can imagine, differ by region. So I just want to wrap up sort of where the sort of intimate relationship between nature and net zero, or biodiverse nature and net zero, and bring together some of the things Aline was talking about with some of the things I've been talking about. So, you know, as said, nature-based solutions are place-based partnerships between people and nature that are underpinned by diversity and implemented by local communities, as those are key to the resilience and the adaptive capacity of those nature-based solutions. When those nature-based solutions are very well designed, they bring multiple benefits, as described in this blue box here. So climate change adaptation, biodiversity protection, enhanced well-being, greenhouse gas reduction. But the extent to which they can be deployed depends on their biophysical potential, like land availability, as well as a range of societal enablers that influence the implementation and upkeep of nature-based solutions over time. So these include good governance, secure land tenure, sustainable livelihoods and finance, nature-positive values, and so forth. But we know that nature-based solutions must be implemented in tandem with rapid reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So high climate policy ambition, which is represented by the blue and purple lines in the lower part of this graph, you know, unless you get that rapid reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, the warming that results from high and increasing greenhouse gas emissions will turn the biosphere into a net source of greenhouse gases. So the increased frequency and intensity of fires, for example, and other extreme events, pests and so forth. Although we do know that these impacts can be reduced through more careful adaptive management of nature-based solutions. And that's where ecological knowledge and the knowledge of Indigenous peoples and local communities becomes very, very important. So the key take-homes from this webinar is that there is no path to net zero without biodiverse nature, and no thriving nature without climate stability. Nature-based solutions in tandem with decarbonisation of all parts of the economy are essential to tackling these interrelated challenges. But there is no silver bullet. You know, effective solutions must absolutely be place-based, they must be systemic, and they must integrate technology and nature-based approaches, and also involve deep behavioural change. Okay, so thank you very much. And now I think we're having some Q&A.
Yeah, excellent. I'll stop sharing. And just to quick start with the Q&A, we have questions already. Thank you for submitting. And Nat, I'd like you to answer this one. So from Steve Garish. Article 6 of the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change, Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, and Article 13 of the CBD all address the public engagement duty of governments. These have been universally neglected by almost all countries, resulting in uniformed pushback on effective policy proposals, leading to politicians fearful of losing votes. What does you think should be done around public engagement?
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve, for the question. This is really, really important, and it feels more important now than ever. I think, you know, after all, the public, we are the voters, we are the consumers, and I do believe that we have agency to make a huge difference and to make the world a more just, safe, more healthy place. So I think it is critically important. I do think there are all sorts of different ways in which we can enhance public engagement. And I think greater engagement with our education systems. I mean, we're speaking from one, but I think there's a lot of work we can be doing within the education system. And we're always saying the sort of no overall silver bullet, but I do think there are ways we could build agency and improve our education of our interdependencies, of our need for a healthy biosphere, for everything that we need. So I think I think that's important. And I think there is a growing body of evidence, really interesting evidence, that shows that the more connected people are with nature, and that can be measured in lots of different ways and is, different from one region to another and one demographic to another. But the more connected people are to nature, the more likely they are to make pro-environmental, pro-social, pro-community choices. So I think really thinking about doing more work on that and sort of sharing that is really important. And I think sometimes we come in very heavy with the climate change argument or the biodiversity argument, when actually in some places we need to sort of focus a bit more on education about what people's needs are, where they are and when they are. And almost always it goes back to the importance of looking after the natural world, whether people are worried about mental health or clean water or clean air or diet, the health crisis. It's all deeply interlinked, and a lot of the challenges we face come from an extractive approach that we have to nature rather than a sort of an interdependent and reciprocal approach.
I saw one question about the Amazon tipping point. And the question is, how realistic is Brazil's pledge to achieve zero deforestation by the end of this decade, 2030, and what key actions are needed to halt deforestation? I try to show the importance of the Amazon and the risks of Amazon achieving a tipping point, not only for Brazilians, but with implications for the whole world. And as a modeler, I can say that according to modeling, and not only our modeling approach, but several different ones, point to the conclusion that there is no need for Brazil to deforest any hectare to continue producing and attending the growing demand in the future. So then there is no need for deforestation. So it's perfectly credible to aim for a zero deforestation. And I would also say that we have legislation in Brazil, which is the Forest Code. The Forest Code dates back to the 60s, so it's a consolidated policy. But we have a problem of enforcement of the Forest Code. For the Amazon, if the Forest Code is implemented, it would reduce the deforestation by 90%, because 90% of the deforestation there is illegal. The Forest Code would not be enough for other biomes like Cerrado, but let's keep the focus here on the Amazon. So we have legislation, there is no need for deforestation, and actually the preservation of the Amazon will contribute for water, climate regulation, and Brazil is a major producer and exporter of commodities, and Brazilian agriculture really depends on nature, depends on the health ecosystems we have there. And what are the problems? Well, if we look at Amazon deforestation rates, historical ones, from 2004 to 2012, Amazon deforestation decreased by 83%. And then it started to increase again. And during Bolsonaro government, it achieved very high levels. And since the change in government, we have now a decrease of almost 50% in Amazon deforestation. So then we have these variations connected to political will and what we need. We have legislation, there is no need. We need a smart mix of policies and policies that are less fragile to political turmoil. And we need a combination of measures. We need the enforcement or implementation of the existing legislations, but also combine this with zero deforestation supply chains, improve traceability and transparency of commodities, especially beef, which is a huge problem for the Amazon, but also create a economy, a social biodiverse economy for the people living in the region. Talking about different ecosystems, I saw a question here about peatlands in the UK. So let me take it this one. Yeah, so how can you highlight the critical role of peatland restoration, especially in the UK context?
Yeah, I mean, we're very glad to see that peatland was highlighted in the recent the seventh budget from the Climate Change Committee. So that's very helpful. I think it's sort of more. There has been some, more and more communications about the importance of peat. It is incredibly important, sort of for lots of reasons. Climate change mitigation, its contribution to that being a very significant one, but restoration of our peatlands and our wetlands is also incredibly important for building our resilience to the impacts of climate change and securing water supplies and so forth. It's all part of the need to sort of restore nature in the UK for the multiple benefits they bring, and peat is a very big one. I mean, to answer your question, again, it all comes down to communications, to education, to lobbying, to working very closely with the wildlife trusts and other conservation organizations around the country, linked to similar conservation organizations around the world who are working on peatlands, and really supporting their efforts to amplify and again, sort of increase public engagement with this. So getting the messages into our schools, getting more documentaries made, and so forth, and highlighting some of the wonderful work. So there's a lot of great work happening around the country, particularly by the Wildlife Trust, but not exclusively on wetland restoration. And I think some of the power of those projects lie in the community engagement. So getting local communities involved in peatland restoration and schools involved in peatland restorations. And that helps sort of socialize the idea that these are really valuable. I mean, ecosystems, they're not as exciting to look at by, to many as a rainforest tree. So trying to get people excited about peat, that sort of presents that challenge. It's not the most charismatic ecosystem at the macro level, but when you zoom in and you see all the extraordinary biodiversity at much closer range, then your appreciation and love for it does increase. So I think it's a communications challenge, but a really great focus for community action. So engaging with that, I think, is an important action that we and individuals can take, and there's lots of opportunities to do that around the UK, I think.
Mm-hmm. No, it's good to mention other ecosystems rather than call attention to other ecosystems rather than forests. And I would like to complement my previous answer. Amazon is close to achieving a tipping point due to deforestation, but we also have to remember, as Nat showed in one of the slides, that the tipping point can also be reached if the temperature increases to a certain threshold. So Brazil has a lot to do in terms of preserving the Amazon, but the whole world, we all collectively have to decrease emissions and achieve net zero, limit temperature increase below 2 degrees, preferably 1.5. So it's a collective responsibility. Nat, I see.
There's one there about definitions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would you like to take this one?
Yeah, why not?
Okay.
So this is again back from Steve. So he said, how would you put the biodiversity definition into a language that the majority of the public can understand? Well, so my attempt was the diversity of life from the level of gene to the level of ecosystem, and leave it there. I mean, I don't know whether that's sufficiently clear, but I think people understand diversity and life and genes and ecosystems. So I think hopefully that works. But I'm very keen to hear other suggestions, if there are any. Yeah. You were going to choose another question, I think, weren't you? Do you want to go ahead with that?
Okay, I see an interesting question here about COP30. Isn't biodiversity nature a central focus at why biodiversity and nature is not a central focus in climate COPs, the climate conferences? Do you expect this to shift at COP30 given its location? And yeah, so COP30. Brazil is gonna host COP30 in the Amazon in Belém do Pará this year. And evidence is showing more and more that these crises are interconnected. We try to cover that during our seminar as well. So one hand, we have land use change and agriculture being responsible for this, corresponding to the second largest source of emissions. But on the other hand, climate change is also a threat, a risk to biodiversity. And we try to show that we need health ecosystems for climate resilience. And on the other hand, climate is essential for protecting biodiversity. So these synergies between climate and biodiversity, it will be present this year in Brazil. It's time to really bring nature to the climate debate. These problems are not and should not be tackled in isolation. And what I would expect this year, I would expect the topics around the need for a transformation in the food system will be there. Also, the need to stop deforestation, and also to be aware of the sustainability limits of the measures, the strategies for the energy transition. Yeah, I would expect these topics very present in COP30 in Brazil. So far, we saw that around 90% of the countries failed to submit their NDCs in time by the deadline. And we need more ambition, climate ambition. But this transition, we need to get away. We need to phase out fossil fuels or transition away from fossil fuels. But this transition, this climate action should not happen at the expense of nature. And this should be very present in this COP, in the COP this year. Would you like to comment?
I think you've covered it very well. Thank you, Eline.
Okay, what else can we take from here? Let me see. This one.
Yes, I could do that one.
Okay. So given the striking difference in biodiversity by latitude, is there a case for introducing new non-native species and new types of habitat in northern latitudes countries rather than just trying to conserve existing biodiversity or only protecting, regrowing, reintroducing native species?
Okay, this is a great question. I mean, what we need in a warming world and a changing world are healthy, flourishing ecosystems. And as you know, we've got a lot of climate change already, baked into the system. Whatever we do with emissions, the climate is changing, and not all species will be able to exist where they currently exist in future. So I think we have to have a sort of very open mind and a sort of experimental and adaptive approach to this. In some parts of the world, including here in the UK, it may well be necessary to, for example, use Mediterranean species of oak in some of our restoration projects, or at least we need to start experimenting with all the cares and the checks and the safeguards in place to ensure that we don't import species into the country that are going to cause harms. It needs to be done very, very carefully and very experimentally. But yeah, we need to, quite possibly, that needs to be part of our adaptive management strategies to use those species. But just to be very clear about healthy ecosystems, natural levels of biodiversity are what we need. So, some ecosystems are very healthy and flourishing and ecologically rich and ecologically functional, but they might have quite low levels of species richness. In other parts of the world, rainforests, coral reefs, and so forth, they have very high levels of the natural levels of biodiversity are very high, and we want to sort of protect that as much as possible. A lot of biodiversity scientists, sort of rather than sort of more pivoting more towards sort of ecological traits and trying to understand rather than being fixed on certain species being in a certain place, are sort of wanting certain ecological functions to be being performed by species. It doesn't really matter what those species are, as long as that ecological function is being met by that community of species. That's the important thing. So as we keep saying, things are very, very place-based. And in some parts of the world, the emphasis needs to definitely be on just trying to protect and enhance and carefully, sustainably manage what's already there. In other parts of the world where the rate of climate change or the rate of warming is much higher and the ecological impacts on communities are much higher, then we might need to do a lot more intervening and bringing species from other parts of the world and so forth. But there's lots of caveats. There's lots more research needed in order to that. There's no simple set of rules to follow on that one. But if our goal are healthy, connected ecosystems with ecological functions in place, then that's the thing to work towards.
I'm afraid we are nearly approaching the end of this seminar and also the end of this seminar series. Any final remarks at this point?
I think our 3 take-homes captured things well. So yeah, I think as I said, we need effective solutions that are place-based, systematic. It's not a question of polarizing the solution space and saying we need technology, but we need nature-based solutions or behavioral. We need all of the above. We need to be working on the technology whilst restoring and protecting and enhancing the nature that's already there, and really opening our minds in the West to seeing ourselves as part of nature, partners of nature, stewards and co-creators of healthy ecosystems, rather than pests or conquerors. So there's a shift in mindset that can be enabled by that, I think, which will be very helpful for us all in lots of different ways.
Yeah, and coming back to the title of the webinar, which is Net Zero Needs Nature, I hope we made clear that although nature-based solutions cannot alone be responsible for achieving net zero, cannot alone. So I'm forgetting the words. Maybe I'm tired and all the tech problems today. But the point is, it's not all about carbon. And I think the most important point here is that we need to look at the climate emergency with a broader, with a broad view, and not only looking at the carbon. It's more than carbon, and we try to show that what we have from nature today depends on health ecosystems. And yeah, we need integrated solutions. We need more and more these synergies, and we have to be aware that the energy transition should not happen at the expense of our beautiful planet and our biodiversity. The final point is that all the recordings and slides will be available in our website. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for being with us until now.
Thank you very much.